Okay, this is an introduction to chapter 5. Now, one of the things about chapter 5 is I don't think you're going to find a chapter like this in any ordinary stat book. At least I've never found one. And yet, this is the stuff that I think I've done the most of, and I found most useful in a variety of roles that I've had professionally over the years. Uh, what I want to talk about this chapter particularly are time-based statistics. Now, this gets dealt with in other places in other ways, but statistics tends to be focused on, for instance, if you get mean and standard deviation, what typically is a specific point in time. I ask 500 people how many cars you own, and we get some numbers that we have a data set, but that's at a specific point in time. You get a lot of data at one time. On the other hand, what you sometimes get is you get data on one thing over time. And you actually get more than one kind of data on it, but the data is time-based. Probably the most common example any of you could imagine of this one, of course, is the stock market. The Dow Jones closing average, it's like it's reported, used to be recorded on the news on a regular basis. If you watch the business news, I suspect it still is. What the Dow Jones is, what the Standard & Poor's is. It's a measure of how the stock market is doing at a particular point in time. It's done every day, every business day over time. It's time-based. Um, what I want to explore with you in this chapter are 4 different kinds of time-based statistics or ways of analyzing statistics. 4 major ways, and there are variations within those. This is going to be a little disorganized. The chapter is a little disorganized because my thinking keeps evolving on this about how to present it and how to make sense of it. That's why we have the video this time, is because this is how I'm thinking about it today at the most recent point. This is September of 2020. This is how my thinking is today about it. And it's changed over time. Uh, there are some different ways of measuring um, or making sense of things over time. One of the key ways we tend to do stuff is with a statistic you've already seen, which is a regression line. That's what we talked about last week. We talked about regression lines. Comes from the Arctic Sea and Ice website, where this looking at the minimum sea ice in the Arctic Circle, and it's measured. Now, what they've done here, which is quite interesting to me, is they've taken this and they've broken it up into 3 different time frames. This was the time frame here from 1979 to 1992 is the top one. The next one's from 93 to 2006. And the bottom one down here is 2007 to 2020. Now you could, and many folks would, put these all together in one long piece. And that's the way I've seen it most often, quite frankly. I've never seen it done quite this way before. What they did is they took 3 14-year periods and they got regression lines for each of the 3 periods. Now, what's notable to me about this is the way they did it, and the part of what they're doing in the process to some extent is saying, for the first 14-year period, the rate was a negative 6.4. There's that's the rate of decline. For this period in here, which was 1993 through 2006, the rate of decline was 13.3%. And then from 2006 on, it's down to, negative 4%. What they're pointing out in this thing is it was declining, and then we had about 14 years where it declined much more rapidly, almost twice as fast. And then we have the third one where it's still declining, but not as fast as it was during this time frame. Now, is that a legitimate way of doing it? I don't know. I've just never seen it done quite this way before. But they did it this way as a way of saying, we think the trends and the changes these things are different over time. that there was a trend over time, and then there was a change in the trend, and then there was a third change in the trend. This is a regression line. This is one way of making sense of time-based data. And I don't talk about too much of this in this chapter, but it is one of the I talk about 4 ways. This is one of the 4 ways, and I think it's an interesting one, an important one. A second way of doing this is what we think about as seasonally adjusted. And let me share this one with you. This is in the book. And what is it? I forget what this is about, but what I have here is some data that comes up, that sales data for each of 4 quarters for 5 years. And what I do with this data, this is a multi-step adjustment. As I first, in this predicted line, I find a regression line and says, okay, the regression line says it should look like this. These are what the values should be. And then I go back through a second time and I say, if you look at this stuff, if you actually graph this data, one of the things you find is for the first quarter, things tend to be, there tend to be changes, things by quarter. Now, this makes sense to some extent. You live in Vermont, you know, for instance, that there are times of the year where you don't go out to the grocery store unless, or try and go out to the restaurants unless you really need to. I mean, we just passed what I think is probably one of the peak foliage weekends here. And I would say it's not a weekend to go out to the restaurants unless you really need to. If you live in a ski town, you know you don't go into town during the Christmas week, and you don't go into town on Martin Luther King's holiday. You try and avoid town then because there's so many tourists around. But if you want to get into a restaurant, you go during stick season, because during stick season, there's nobody around. That's November basically around here. There are predictable times of year when businesses are up and businesses are down. And you try and find out what's the pattern of that, so that when I look at this fall foliage season, I can compare it to past fall foliage seasons. And I can look at that in relation to an overall trend. This is a more complex way of doing it. This is using the regression line plus seasonal adjustments. And I try and show you some stuff on how we couldn't do that one. That's the second major approach to this stuff that I'm talking about. A third major approach is what we think about as smoothing. Now, smoothing's interesting, and then there are 2 different kinds of smoothing I'm going to show you here. The most common type way of smoothing we're seeing right now is a moving average. And if you haven't seen a chart like this around recently, you haven't been paying attention. And I showed this one, and I showed a different one. They can do them slightly different, but it's dealing with what's called a moving average. And what we're doing around COVID stuff is we're doing a lot of 7-day moving averages. Now, the reason for a moving average, the big reason for it, is because you get variations day to day that have nothing to do with the underlying phenomena. Some of the variations we get in number of new cases, COVID cases reported, depends on, have they just opened another COVID testing station someplace, or has the machine broken down someplace, or have they finally gotten to a backlog of cases? Those sorts of things affect the numbers. By going at a 7-day average, moving average, you look at the last 7 days, the value before that is the previous the 7 days just -1, and it keeps rolling this average over for the latest 7 days. And what that does is it smooths out the extraneous variations that tend to be in the numbers and gives you a sense about, well, this is how the numbers really are running overall for something. In this case here, at this point, and this was in May of, this is not current, this was in May of 2020, the moving 7-day average was 2, which is pretty low. And while there was a spike right here in terms of the number of cases the last day, it's like, yeah, but it doesn't affect the moving average much. It only affects a seventh of it. Moving averages are really useful, and looking at time-based data when you want to know the trend of the most recent time limit. Now, I would note for you, there's another one that I mentioned in passing in the written materials, and that is an exponential moving average. The difference between a regular moving average, by the way, moving averages, the ones you see right now are all 7 days. There's nothing magical about that number. That's a chosen number. You could make it a 4-day moving average or a 9-day moving average. I mean, it's like, that's your choice. Right now about COVID stuff, the generally accepted norm of that is, so you have comparability, is 7 days. But it could be different. You know, we could decide that, no, we really want a 6-day moving average because we think that's more useful for some reason. No good rationale for that, except right now that 7 days is the accepted piece. And it always looks at, a moving average always looks at, a 7-day moving average looks at the last 7 days all the time. And it's always, you know, the next day it's like, okay, you take that 7 days, and the next day you take that 7 days. So there's overlap between those things. So it's like a 5-day moving average, and then it's like, well, then you have a 5-day average with one new thing, and you dropped one. And then 5 days, you know, you drop. So it keeps changing around in the process, and it evolves with new cases coming in. A different type of moving average is the exponentially weighted moving average. And mathematically what it does, and I'm not going to get into actually doing this or asking you to do it, but I'd like you to know about it, is it says, we're not going to take the last 7 days. What we're going to do is, we're going to weight the last 4 days of those 7 more heavily than the first 3. Got my fingers. See if I can keep up with counting. It weights more recent numbers more than older numbers. A place where you might think about that being useful, particularly appropriate, is, for instance, with stock market. Yeah, I want to know I might look at this 30-day trend with the stock market, what the values of a particular stock are for the last 30 days. And that would tell me, is this stock tending to increase in value, is it tend to going down? And the moving average gives me a sense of that, you know, despite some day-to-day variations of things going on. An exponentially weighted moving average would say, yes, I want to look at the 30 days, but I really want to focus on the last 5 days. And those days I want to weight more heavily than the previous 25 days. So that's an exponentially weighted moving average. I've never actually used one of those, but I know people who follow stocks and do some of those sorts of things, do a lot of that kind of stuff. And just so you know, there are different kinds. Those are the 2 major kinds. There are more variations that we can go off on, but those are 2 major kinds of smoothing processes. And the intent of the moving average or exponentially moving average is to smooth out the day-to-day variations that we don't think really make a lot of difference. Those day-to-day variations are sometimes due to extraneous factors. Like I say, with COVID, they open up a new test site, and so numbers jump. And it's like, oh my God, but it's like, well, but the overall rate hasn't changed much. And the moving average helps take care of that piece. So there's 3. Let me just go back over it. I talked about the use of the trend line or regression line. And that's a generic sort of measure of how things are doing over time. Then I talked about time-based adjustments. Those are some of the more complex things because it's a multi-step process to assess them. And I try and show you some of this, and I provide a file in which I show I actually go out about doing that. Then there's the smoothing process. Both 7 days, you know, moving average smoothing or exponential moving average. The fourth type of thing that comes up, here it is. This comes from, that's not really what I want, the one I want. Here's what I want. It's bigger. It's a thing called run charts. And these are used specifically in the area where they're using two major areas. One is manufacturing and the other is in healthcare. And it's of some variable that's important to you that you're measuring over and over and over again. And you're either taking samples or you're taking a daily sample, or you're stopping every, you're checking something on some regular basis. And what you have in this is you have an average value of it, and there's always variation around that average. And then you have a lower control limit and an upper control limit. Now those things are typically set to some fairly arbitrary processes, but they're not totally arbitrary. But you say, it really can't vary beyond this or below this. If it gets out of those things, it causes a problem for us. Let me give you a manufacturing example. I once worked with a company that made the little tiny plastic bottles that you get your shampoo in when you get to, when you go to a hotel and they've got little bottles of shampoo in there. They made those little tiny plastic bottles, and they made the caps for the little tiny plastic bottles. Now they had to make sure that the variation in diameter of the top of the plastic bottles and the variation in diameter of the caps were within certain control limits, or otherwise what would happen is the cap would fall off and you'd spill shampoo all over the place, or the cap wouldn't fit on, and again it was wasted stuff. So they would measure, they would take samples of the things they were manufacturing, and they were manufacturing like 1,000 an hour of these things. So they would, about every hour, they'd pick out 10 of them, and they'd check out the 10 things and see what the measurements are and see whether they were okay or not. And it was a way of checking to see that the process, what they called the process, was in control. The tool they use for that is a thing called a run chart. Now, this is a tool specifically within statistical process control or the whole quality control area. A run chart looks at some variance, some variable, where you have an average value, which is what they say here in this case would be 0.2954, and a lower control limit and an upper control limit. Say, how is it staying within that? And if it is, generally you're okay, except that if this variation really is random, you shouldn't have too many things on one side you shouldn't have too many values below the average. And that gets into an issue about probability. And I'm going to hold off on that. I want to say more about that when we get into the next chapter. Well, actually, yeah, the chapter on probability. I'll say a little bit more about this whole process, about how do you figure that. We're not going to go into this, but I would tell you, I was exposed to statistical quality control, statistical process control, relatively late in my life. Well, middle of my life, really, but I've done hunks of statistical work before then, and I'd never heard of this. And when I first heard of statistical quality control, I kind of went, ooh, this must be some sort of abstract, complex statistics. And the truth is, statistical quality control is really pretty simple and very straightforward and useful. If you are in healthcare or manufacturing, I all but guarantee you, people in you have folks who are doing statistical quality control. And the statistics are not complex, but there's a lot of them, and there's some specific sort of stuff about it. I'm just teasing here, basically, because I think it's another way that you could do time-based statistics. And that's what I'm trying to get you to think about here. That's what this whole chapter is about, our time-based statistics and how to make sense of those things. Now, I'm not going to ask you to do much of this thing. Actually, I'm going to encourage you to try out some stuff. And I think particularly moving averages, because moving averages are not hard to find. It just takes some time and energy to work them out. And there's actually in the statistical package, the extra one. There's a thing in there that allows you to do it or gives you ways of doing it that's even more simple. In fact, it'll do a lot of it for you. I'd like you to play with that a little bit. Mostly I'm trying to give you a sense of saying, here's an aspect of statistics that I think are really useful, but it takes tools from several different places and brings them into the thing of looking at how do statistics change over time? How does your data change over time? Because that's a place which has a lot of specific use to it. And that's what this chapter is about. This chapter, I'm not weighting heavy in grades. It's more conceptual. It's more, I think, you ought to know about this stuff because you're going to run into it at some point. I mean, if you haven't seen the COVID things and this 7-day moving averages, you haven't been reading the papers or looking at news because it's out there. But this is the useful sort of stuff that I think it's worth knowing about. And that's why I'm presenting this chapter. That's it for today.